So before we get into anything a bit more fancy, we'll have a look at the basics. So what JavaScript is, where it goes. So for this section of the playlist, I'm going to be using Chrome. And the reason I'm going to be using Chrome is that one of the most difficult things about using JavaScript is working out whether you've got an error. So in the early days, so back in the days of like Internet Explorer 4 or something, Netscape Navigator, it used to give you an error message whenever anything went wrong. These days, browsers do their best to hide both client-side error messages and, in fact, those from the server as well. So I'm using Chrome, and what I've installed is an extension called the JavaScript Errors Notifier, and that's probably the easiest way of developing a JavaScript page, because it will pop up and it will tell you what the error is when I'm doing it. So let's just go back and have a look in. So I'm using Blue Griffin. I've got the split view here. I've got a basic page, so I've got a header. I just put a text box, a paragraph, and a button on it, but they don't do anything yet. And if you can see, if you want to see what those look like, so that's obviously just text. We can type in some stuff in there. That's just a paragraph, and then the button clicks, but it doesn't do anything. So the first thing is, what is JavaScript? Well, JavaScript is a programming language. It's from the C family. So if you're coming from C or JavaScript, Java, it'll look familiar. So it uses lots of curly brackets, and each of the statements is terminated with a semicolon, which you might not be used to if you've come to somewhere like Python. Also, unlike Python, it doesn't. Unlike Python, it has something to indicate the end of a loop or the end of an optional section created in selection with an if, like most of the languages, in fact. And all the things that you've been used to, so things like loops, decisions, variables, etc., all exist. If you come from kind of GCSE level Python, most of the concepts will be the same. The only difference will be how you display the results, because you're used to probably just using print and displaying stuff, but obviously you can style things much more precisely on a web page. So we'll have a look at how you refer to bits of the page, how you actually change bits of the page rather than just adding to the bottom, and actually where you put your code in the first place. So I tend to put my code at the top. So within an HTML page, there is a script tag, and you used to have to say what type of script it was, but now you don't. So I tend to put it at the top in the header. Some people prefer to put it at the bottom, and I can see the benefit of doing that. So some people put it between the body and the HTML, for example, because it's not part of the body of the page. Swings and roundabouts, really. I like to have it at the top so I can see it, basically, but if you have it at the top of the page, then obviously it needs to load before the visible content, so there might be a slight delay in the content of your page appearing if you're on a slow connection. Also, if you want your code to run straight off, so if you're not using any functions, it's just going to run, then you're not going to be able to refer to any of the elements on the page because they won't be there yet. So the elements have to be created before the JavaScript. So if you want to change the color of the background or add some text, as soon as the page loads, you might prefer to have it at the bottom. There is another way around that, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about how you actually trigger your code. So I'm old school, so I tend to do that sort of thing in my JavaScript. What that is, that's an HTML comment, and the reason I got into the habit of putting those in is to hide JavaScript from browsers that didn't support it in the early days. So I think I said in the first video, I've been programming JavaScript for about 25 years. Some people either turned it off or browsers didn't even support it in those days. So that stopped them giving an error, but most people learning now probably don't bother with that. So there are various things you can do. Obviously, you've got variables. Variables, you declare them with var, so var for variable. So unlike C, where you might have int or ch for characters, you don't need that. You can declare multiple variables on the same line. So that declares A and B existing as a variable. Doesn't get upset if you don't do that, but it's, I think it's good practice, or it's considered to be good practice. Then you can obviously set them. Now you can do it in one line. So actually you can do things like this. You can say A equals 1. So just like Python, it uses 1 equal sign for making it equal to and 1 for checking if it is equal to. There are quite a lot of similarities with Python, but you need to be a little bit careful. So, for example, some things that look the same in Python and JavaScript, in fact, aren't. So, if you're used to using pop to remove things from a list, pop in Python can remove stuff from anywhere in a list, but pop in JavaScript can only remove it from the end. Also, replace. So, if you want to replace characters in a string, in Python, that will replace every occurrence of a particular character or substring, but in JavaScript, it only removes the first one, so you can be caught out doing that. The other thing that catches me out regularly as somebody swaps between different programming languages is capitalization. So in Python, true and false have to begin with capital letters, and in JavaScript, they're all in lowercase, but the principles are kind of the same. So that's obviously, that means create a variable called A, and set it to 1, create a variable called B, set it to 2. So you can just do stuff like this. So you can say alert. So probably the kind of the JavaScript hello world is this kind of thing. So hello world. So you can pop stuff up. So if I save that, alert is a pop-up box. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the browser. I'm going to refresh, and it says hello world. Notice that it holds up the rendering of the page. So the rest of the page isn't going to appear until I click OK. So you need to be a little bit careful how you use that. What you can also do is, so that pops it up. You can write it to the console, which you then can't see, but you can use it for testing purposes. So console.log, we'll put it in the console, which you can then pop up with it Shift Control J. There's document.write, which will, let's have a look at that. So if I refresh this page, document.write actually writes it onto the page itself. Now notice it's appeared at the top, and that's because my JavaScript's at the top. So if my JavaScript was instead down the bottom, down there, it would appear at the bottom because the code would run after the page had been rendered. So that's another thing you might want to consider. Probably what most people do, though, I would say, is, if I just undo that, pop it back at the top, is rather than having that in just the code that kind of runs straight off, you can put it in a function. So function, and then let's just call it do stuff. So obviously that's not a sensible name, but actually it's going to do a variety of different things. It's just for demonstration purposes. So one of the things I don't like about Blue Griffin, I mentioned its positives in the first video, is the way it does the indentation. And actually I forgot the semicolon at the end. So that can cause problems, but it doesn't seem to have done here. So now if I save this and we have a look at the page, hello world doesn't actually appear anywhere. And that's because although that code exists, it's not being triggered. So there's a variety of different ways in which you can trigger your code. So one of the ways is using a button or some other kind of interactivity. So here I've created a button. So button, there is a button tag, but I've used, again, probably because I'm old, input type equals button, and the value is what it says on it. But then it also has an additional property on click, and that is what you want it to do when you click it. So, and you can put some inline JavaScript, so you could say on click equals document.write, whatever, or you can give it the name of a function. That's what I tend to do. So if I say get that button to run, do stuff, then now if I refresh that page, when I click the button, it will write that to the page. But you need to be a little bit careful for, as you can see there, for unintended consequences. So you probably don't want to use document.write, and in fact Google will try to discourage you from using document.write. Google's got a bit of a thing at the moment about something called cumulative layout shift, and that's doing things to your page which cause it to kind of change size or stuff to shift down. So
probably what you don't want to do is just keep writing stuff to the end of your page or overwriting your page. So what you can do is you can refer to something that already exists. So you could pop the text in there, or you could replace the paragraph with it. So instead of doing document.write, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick an element. So here's my paragraph. So if you remember the previous video, we talked about IDs and classes. So we've got an element called paragraph. So I'm going to say document dot get element by ID. So notice JavaScript uses camel case for its commands. It can be case sensitive. Some things it might not work because you've got your capitalization wrong. So then paragraph. I've called it paragraph, and then I'm going to call it. So depending on what type of element it is, there are different properties. So there's a property on kind of text-based elements, things like paragraphs, headings, divs, called inner HTML, and basically that's the contents of that paragraph or div or whatever it is. So we don't need the brackets in there because it is just a string. So what that's doing is that's selecting the paragraph element, and then we're looking at the inner HTML property of that, and we're setting it to hello world. So this is good for changing the text of things that are already on the page. So I'll quite often use this for giving instructions or whatever, or in fact setting the text on the page in the first place. So my connections wall, for example, putting the text into the tile, so it fetches the stuff from the database and then puts the text in afterwards. So if I do click me now, it changes the content of that paragraph, and obviously it's already done it, so it's not going to do it again. But you can do all the same stuff you used to in your programming. So you can say plus equals, which has the same effect as it would do in Python. So that means add to the existing value of whatever the thing is. So now it'll add it on the end rather than replacing it. So all the usual kind of standard ideas apply, including things like local variables and global variables. So these are global because they're up here outside the function. I can move them down. So you might be thinking, okay, well, no types there. That's quite handy. But what about if we do something like this? So I'm just going to move those inside, make them local, because I know some of you frown upon the idea of global variables. So we've got two local variables called a and b, the values 1 and 2. So what you can do is you can do things like this. So if I say a plus b, what do we think that's going to do? So a is 1, b is 2. So if I write a plus b into the contents of the paragraph element, what's that going to look like? Well, let's have a look. So in this particular occasion, it's given me 3. But it is a little bit hit or miss. So sometimes it might give you 12, because just as in Python, plus will add numbers, but it will also add text. It will concatenate text, particularly if you've got if that text has come from somewhere else. So if you're getting that text from a box, for example, it's not always clear whether it's a numerical or a string. So sometimes you need to be a little bit careful. You can just there are commands such as eval, or sometimes you can just bodge it. So if you do that, it kind of multiply it by 1. It just forces it to become a number. So containers, boxes, paragraphs, divs, headers have an inner HTML property. Things like buttons and text boxes have a value property. So if I wanted to instead put that value inside the text box, so that's called text box. Let's see what that does. So if I refresh that page now, when I click that, it puts it in there. So different types of elements sometimes have different properties that you can change. Also,
So I'm writing these properties here. We can also read in those values. So if you were using that for input, and you typed hello, then what you could do is you could read the property of that. So you could do things like this. So we don't need A and B, do we? So let's go that. So what that's doing is it's reading the value of the text box into A, and then what we can do is we can pop that somewhere else. So let's say we'll write that into the paragraph. And we can add stuff to it. So we can say you typed, and then use string concatenation there. So I'm reading in the value from, I'm reading value, and I need to pop it into, actually it's inner HTML, isn't it? So now, maybe I'll just zoom back out again, so you can see that. Right, so if I refresh this now, if I type in A and click the button, it'll say you typed A. If I change it and do it again, so these things are both for reading and for writing for the most part. So what about, so that's triggering the code using a button. It is actually possible to get the code to trigger on other events. So there's things called events that you can trap. So actually what you can do is, if you wanted to get that paragraph to update as you type stuff in, there's an event called on, there's one on input, and there's also on change. The difference there is on input will do it as you're typing in. On change only does it after the element has lost focus, so it wouldn't update the text until you'd move the cursor out of the box. So again, so we'll just use the same thing. So do stuff. If I can type properly, let's do stuff. Okay, so now hopefully if I run that, the paragraph will now get updated as I'm typing. So there's different ways of triggering the functions. What you can also do is, obviously with HTML you can have default values in things like text boxes. So if I say, so here's my text box, if I say value equals default, that's what it says in there to begin with. So another way of triggering the code to run is if you want it to start automatically after the page is loaded, a better way than putting it at the bottom is to use the onload event of the body. So the body is the whole page effectively. So you can say onload equals do stuff. And so now if I run that, we can see that actually we didn't actually type default, but it's run the code and swapped the content as soon as the page finished loading. So if you're on a slow connection, it would wait until it had fully loaded before it triggered that code. So you can do stuff like that. That's quite useful. There's also other properties. So if you wanted, if you relied on something that checked the size of the page, for example, there are other events that you can trap. So there's one like on resize. So what you could, so I'll just use alert for that. So if you want something to happen when somebody resizes the page, maybe a redraw of content, for example. Now, obviously, you need to be a little bit careful with this because you can't have speech marks inside speech marks, but you can use either type of thing there, apostrophe or speech marks. So if you
if we refresh that, hopefully now, if I resize this, yeah, it says it's resized. So in either direction. There you go. So popping it up is a bit of an irritation. So I'm just going to remove that again. But see, if it didn't pop anything up, that wouldn't be a problem. So different ways of triggering stuff. I'll remove that out because obviously it doesn't. We hadn't typed that. Okay, so we've looked at variables. You can create arrays. So there's a variety of different ways of creating arrays. W3 Schools is a good source of stuff like this. So you can either create a blank array. So you can say things like var a equals new array 10, for example. So that'll create an array of 10 elements. Or you can just stick the stuff in. So you can say a or var a equals, and then you can say like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you can refer to them in the same way as you do in Python. So you could do like alert a2. So a lot of similarities with other programming languages that you might have used. Don't forget the semicolons at the end, which always catches me out as I keep switching between programming languages. We'll come back and have a look at that later. So here I've only used get element by ID, and because IDs should be unique, that only finds one thing. So if I use, there are corresponding methods called get element by class name and various other things, and obviously that would bring back an array of items. So then you'd have, if A was dot element by a class name div, not div, well, we haven't got it on there, but like in the previous example, lamp, then we'd have A0, A1, just like an array, and we'll have a look at that in future videos. But that's some of the basics. So where you put your code, you can put it at the top, put it at the bottom. How you trigger it, so it will run, but if you put stuff in functions, then you can put trigger it with certain events, so like clicks of buttons. We looked at on input from a text box, and we got it to run when the page was loaded. And we've had a quick look at how to refer to stuff using .getElementById, but we'll come and look at that in a bit more detail in future videos. So that's the kind of core stuff. And then in the subsequent videos, we'll have a look at kind of specific techniques that I've used on my page to create, certain effects.